I don't know about you, but I love the sound of twin 40s. When I was a kid, my parents used to take me to stage rallies, and I asked, what was it on those cars that made that lovely sound? And I was always told, oh, it's just a race engine. And it took me years to find out what made the noise. Those carburetors, beautiful. And this Alfa Romeo here came with twin 40s right out of the factory. You've got to love the Italians for that. In fact, if they put barbecue chicken on their pizzas, I might move there. The next stage on the Renault 5. It's been a little while since I worked on this car, but I've now blasted the front of the vehicle and any other bits of rust that needed attention. In this video I'll be painting the underneath of the car, which will involve seam sealing, stone chip, and then finally 2K paint over the top. The first thing I'm going to do is protect the blasted steel with Hydrate 80. That's a product from Built Hamber, and it's like cure rust. You just brush it on and it will protect the steel from flash rusting. This is a product I use all the time because I think it does a better job of preventing rust formation than primers, but it's also nice and thin. A quick sand and you're ready to paint over the top. I do aid the drying speed with a heat gun, and this is convenient but also prevents the product forming a rust-like appearance. There is a small amount of phosphoric acid in the product, and this doesn't like to be left on steel too long. It's a similar process to deoxidizing, where you wash off phosphoric acid with water. Leave it too long and it will leave a brown yellowish tinge. I don't think there is a problem with this, but it doesn't look good. If you dry it, it certainly looks better. This is an example of why I like the Hydrate 80. This car has been sat in the workshop for about 6 months, and we can see a bit of rust has formed here and along this join, and you might not see that if I had etch primed it. So the fact that I can see it is a benefit. The Hydrate 80 stuff is really quite thin, so it reveals everything there is to see. The rest of this I know is good, so there's no problem in painting over the top of it. On this section here, someone has jacked the vehicle and dented this section in. I can't think of a neat way to get this out, so I'm going to cut round the edge, straighten it and weld it back in again. I think that is the welding underneath finished. One place the blasting did reveal is this section here. Some holes on the outside, some holes underneath. And the blaster reveals everything, and that is the good thing about blasting. It doesn't miss anything. That didn't look rusty at all before I blasted it. The next thing I'm going to do is sand the entire bottom of the car. It's not necessary to do this, but I like a mechanical bond wherever possible. Etch primer will obviously etch into bare steel, but it won't etch into Hydrate 80, which is what I put on, so best to give it a mechanical bond. The underneath is fully sanded now. Took about 5.5 hours to sand all of that. Time to start masking. So here's the plan. As you can see, it's all masked off. I'm going to etch prime it with a spray gun. Let that dry obviously, and then I'm going to go around with Tiger Seal all around all these overlap joints, and there are loads of them, so it's going to take a while. After that, I shall apply U-Pole stone chip, 2 coats of that. It'll have to dry for 24 hours, and then finally top coat in the 2-pack blue. Using panel wipe every time before spraying is a good habit to have. I think the only chance of any oil contamination would be from the air tools, and that would be very minor, but spraying is very fussy on surface preparation. The panel wipe I'm using is Octral TD20. It has a low evaporation rate and won't cause streaks in the paint like some other cheaper brands. I've had trouble with panel wipe that evaporates too quickly. Before I just load this stuff in the gun and start spraying, I'm going to have a look at the data sheet, and I always do this for every product I spray. This is why I've got a big folder of data sheets for every product I've ever used. Not everybody realizes there are data sheets available online for nearly every product on sale. If there isn't a data sheet, then I probably wouldn't buy that product. So let's check that this product is suitable for what we need. Passenger cars, yeah, that's fine. It says here, do not apply under polyester spraying putty or on thermoplastic. Well, I'm not doing either of those. I don't use polyester spraying putty, and it's obviously not plastic. Down here it says, never put an unfinished car with wash primer in a humid environment. Well, that's important because etch primers are porous and a humid environment is going to cause rust. Substrates is what it's been sprayed over the top of. So that's cured old coatings, galvanized steel, and most types of aluminium. They've left out steel, but that's obvious. Finishing materials, 2K surfaces, which is 2-pack primers, except epoxy primer. Well, you wouldn't put epoxy on top of etch primer. Cleaning equipment, that's important too. TR51 they recommend, which is Octral's version of standard thinners. Now, the important stuff, mixing ratio, 1:1, which is 50% one product, 50% the other. Application viscosity, this is DIN cup 4mm at 20 degrees Celsius. Air spray is 18 to 20 seconds. What this is a measurement of the paint's thickness. And it's quite important, actually it's very important when you're applying top coats. It's not so important when applying etch primers, but getting this consistent will really help you with consistent spraying. And it's something that not even the experts do sometimes, is measure the viscosity of the paint. I'll go into that in more detail when it comes to the top coat. Next, we've got some recommendations on a gravity feed gun, 1.3 to 1.5 nozzle diameter. Well, yeah, okay, that's recommended, that's fine. The spray gun I'm going to use has actually got a 2mm nozzle diameter, and I don't think it's all that important when spraying etch primers, but it can be very important when spraying base coats and things like that to get a uniform pattern. There's some recommended pressures for spraying, but I'll be using high volume, low pressure. That's the type of gun. I pretty much spray everything about 40 psi. Next, spray coats. So we've got 1 to 2 coats recommended, 10 to 20 microns. That is the film thickness, and 10 microns is 0.01 millimeters. So it's a very thin coat. On a new car, you'll find the total paint on a new car will be about 80 to 120 microns, and 10 to 20 microns of that will be your etch primer. Flash off, that is the time we need to leave the car before putting on the next coat. This is 5 to 10 minutes at 20 degrees C. So if it's a cooler day or whatever, then you're going to have to leave it longer. It basically comes down to if it looks wet, it's too soon to spray another coat. The drying time is 10 to 15 minutes. And so this is the time we need to leave it before we can put the next lot of paint. So the next process, if that's, in my case, it's going to be stone chip. So that's the minimum amount of time we can leave it. I would probably leave it an hour just to be safe. And finally, pot life. 16 to 18 hours is the maximum time we can leave this Octral paint mixed with this activator. Graduated mixing cups are a must when mixing paint, and I also filter the paint even when it's new. I can only recollect having a problem once in all the years spraying with a gun blockage, and that was irritating enough. As a final check, I always use the air from the spray gun just to remove any bits of dust. Not all that important when it comes to underneath the car, but a good habit to have. My spraying method is to go around all the edges first. Paint will always run away from the edge, so the more chances you give an edge to get enough paint, the better. There is a gun setting called fan control, and I've set this to long and narrow. This helps me to paint where I want it without causing runs in other areas. Some people may think I should be wearing painter's overalls, and I've got some which I would certainly wear if not painting the underneath of a car. They're a bit hot to wear and not worth the discomfort on this occasion. With the edges flashed off, I can now paint the rest of it, of course adjusting my fan control to something more suitable. A fan adjustment will also require a fluid adjustment to maintain the same paint application rate. With the car turned upright, some bits missed become obvious to spot. With the gun up the other way, I can get to these missed sections. I always disassemble the gun on every occasion and clean it out. I think this is another reason why I have so few problems with gun performance. The automatic gun cleaners do not do a good enough job in my experience. I've got just about everywhere I can with a spray gun, using different angles to try and help me. But there's always going to be somewhere you just can't get, and just behind there, I couldn't get in there with the spray gun. All I can do is use a little paintbrush. Next stage is Tiger Seal, and yes, I've got a data sheet for that too. It says it's okay to go over paint, applications via cartridge caulking gun. It says overpainting can be done once it's cured or skinned if using polyurethane paint. Now this stage is really important. We must go around all of the overlapped joints. Everywhere there's an overlap needs to be sealant. This is where the rust will form. It's not going to form in the middle of a panel, it's going to form at the joints. If you want to make the sealant look neat, you can mask off the section to give neat, straight and uniform beads. That is a nice, neat way of doing it. It's just going to take a long time doing all these seams like that. I'll probably do it for a little while, but might have to go the quick route and not mask anything off. It doesn't look anywhere near as neat, but actually by the time you've got your stone chip and paint on top, you wouldn't notice the lack of neatness in the finished item. That's the sealant done. Took about 5 hours to go around all those seams, and no, I didn't mask it all off. It could have been prettier, but I think the important thing is that sealant is there. This is the gun I'm using, and I have the air pressure about 90 psi. It's always a good idea to test the spray pattern before trying it on the vehicle. I like the pressure this high because it does a good job of getting into all the corners and hard to reach places. I'm putting the paint on lightly for the first coat. That's the first coat of stone chip. Just waiting for everything to flash off. There's just a couple tiny little bits. See, just in there, it's just a little tiny bit wet. As you may know, it's very important for the first coat to flash off before you put on the next one. Otherwise you can trap solvent and that will come out as solvent pop later on. This first coat was very light, but it's still taken an hour and a half so far to get to the point where a next coat is possible. The next coat I'll put on much thicker, and obviously that will take even longer for the solvent to evaporate. The next coat is going to be put on much thicker, and I'm using a torch and looking for the light reflection. I use a torch for every top coat I spray and some primers. Despite booth lights, there are always times you can't see the light reflection in the paint. The torch I've got is very bright indeed, and it shows in the video. Measuring the coating thickness so far, we have 250 to 300 microns. Okay, time for the shiny bit. So the blue I've got is acrylethane. It's a 2K acrylic made by HMG. It's SC601 as the code. And let's look at the data sheet. We've got a hardener of 9004, but because it's acrylic, I can substitute that for 362. And I'm going to do that today because the pot life is only 1 to 2 hours of the 9004, and the pot life of the 362 is 4 to 5 hours. And that means I'll have plenty of time to apply the paint. Now the viscosity. It says 21 to 26 seconds B4 cup. I'm running a Ford 4 and there is a conversion chart for changing it over, but I've made some notes on what I've done before, and I did some wheels with 20% thinner. That was 26 seconds at 18 degrees Celsius, and I was quite happy with that. And so I'm going to go for 26 seconds again, because the underneath of the car is quite a rough finish, and you want it a bit thicker for that type of spraying, because it will go on faster and you're less likely to get runs because it's already orange peely anyway. If I was spraying the outside of a car, a very flat surface, I definitely want to reduce this down to more like 21 seconds, and that will give me a much better flow out. It will take more coats to get the same amount of film thickness, but the finish will be nice and flat. If you haven't seen one before, this is a viscosity cup. It's a Ford 4, which means it's got a 4mm hole in the bottom. And despite washing it out, that hole does get smaller. Paint does build up in that hole, and I very occasionally run the 4mm drill bit down through it just by hand, just to make sure it's the size it should be. Now we need to know our mixing ratios, and we've got a ratio of 2 parts base, 1 part hardener, and 0.5 thinner, which translates to 25% thinner, which is how it's normally written. This company have decided to do it that way for some reason. So 25% is the recommended amount of thinners, but that's 25% of the base only, not the base and the hardener. And I'll prove that to you now. This is a standard mixing cup, and it has the ratios printed on. We've got 2 to 1, 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and we'll be using 2 to 1. And it also gives us the amount of thinners to add after. So if we want 25%, we can add that to the mix. I don't actually use those thinner markings. I've got something more accurate, which is a 0 to 100 milliliters beaker. I filled up the mixing cup to the bottom of the 2 for 2 to 1, and that is 190 milliliters. 190, 30% of that is 57, so that's what I've got in here. 57 in there. So if I fill this back up to the 1, which would be the hardener, and then add the thinners, let's see where it goes. That's the hardener added. Let's add the thinner. And we've got near enough 30%. This is actually a good way of testing how accurate your mixing cups are. I've mixed the paint with its hardener, but I haven't put any thinners on yet. So now I want to just see what the flow rate is without adding any thinners. Without adding any thinners at all, it took 45 seconds, which is way too thick. I've added 20% thinners, and that's reduced the time through the viscosity cup down to 25 seconds, and that will be just about right. The white and black square you can see is called a spray out card, and it tells you how well the paint is covering. When you can't make out the black squares, then you have full coverage. Coat this every time you spray a coat on the car. Again, spraying all the edges first. Turning the car at various different angles, and you also have to spray from underneath to give yourself the best chance of getting everything with the spray gun. I applied 3 coats to give full coverage and left it at least 15 minutes between coats. I increased the amount of thinner to 25% on the last coat, as I saw a paint run on my spray out card. Paint runs are less likely when you increase the amount of thinner, as there is less paint in the same amount of fluid. It will go on drier and thinner, which might be the opposite to what you would expect. I check all areas with a torch before committing to calling the job finished. And there we have it. I pulled all the masking tape off while the paint was still wet. I think that's important. I'm very happy with the finish. I can't see any runs, but I'm sure there is one somewhere. Yep, found one. Can't see anywhere else, but there's one you can just about make out there. I can't do a spray job without getting one run, so I'm happy with that. It took me 5 hours to spray that top coat, so it's a good job I chose the slower hardener. The paint that's gone on the vehicle in total has been 1 litre of etch primer, 3 tubes of Tiger Seal, 5.5 litres of stonechip, and finally 2 litres of SC601 2-pack blue. The only thing I will say is if you're spraying 2-pack, make sure you're using the right breathing apparatus. This stuff is nasty if you breathe it in. Thanks for watching. See you next time.